Hello, everybody, and welcome. It is a great pleasure to have with us Kate Robinson, the daughter of Sir Ken Robinson. In his welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
In his final years, Sir Ken Robinson was working on a book that would serve as his manifesto. And when he received this cancer prognosis in August 2020, he asked Kate, his daughter, to finish writing this manifesto and continue his work. The book, Immagina, Creating a Future for us All, has been translated and published by Erickson with the title Immagina che, come creare un futuro migliore per tutti. So, Kate, it is clear from the first page of the book that your father has inspired your life and that you had a very close and special relationship with him. You have dedicated the book to him with the words, "For Dad, my hero." And you've also written, Dad was incredibly gifted, but he was also a gift himself. So tell us about him and how he lived his life and translated his ideas about fostering the talent of people in his everyday life, and especially in his life of being a father to you.
Well, he you're absolutely right. Dad was and is my hero. He was, an incredible father and an incredible person, a very rare breed of person. I think I'm yet to meet somebody quite like him. I suppose the first thing to say is that Dad had polio when he was 4. So he spent his life walking with a leg brace, a caliper. What that meant in the 1950s for him was that he learned very quickly that, if he was walking down a street, maybe people would giggle or they'd point or they'd stare. And he learned very quickly to not walk away from anything that frightened him. That he would, he'd see something that maybe he was intimidated or nervous, and he'd walk straight towards it rather than turning and going the other way. I think that, from a perspective of a child looking at their parent, that's such an incredible lesson to have picked up.
Yeah,
That if things are scary, you go towards them, if they're worth doing.
yeah,
So that was one, and we were very close. We worked together for a number of years. And when we found out that he was passing away, it was my privilege really to be able to commit to him that I would spend the rest of my life continuing his work, and the work that we had been doing together. As a father, I mean, one of the reasons that I started working with him in the first place is that he lived and breathed his work. This wasn't a 9 to 5. So growing up, and he worked closely with my mum as well. So growing up in our household, these topics that are in the book were the topics that were had at the dinner table. You'd wake up in the morning, you could hear them in the other room talking about it, and long car journeys, they were in the front talking about it. So it really instilled a huge passion, and both he and my mum lived and breathed, but also walked the talk of it. So they encouraged me and my brother to try as many things as we possibly could. And we didn't have a huge amount growing up, but and anything that we did have, they put towards us.
yeah.
Trying on as many different things as we could, and that carried on. He had a knack for seeing what was special in everybody and for being totally present. And now I'm a mother myself. I actually understand how hard that can be in parenting to give somebody your full attention.
I can imagine. And
Yeah,
also, as you say, leave the talk,
yeah,
it's not just a
exactly.
talk, but actually leave it.
Yeah, exactly. So from my perspective, it was I said to him when we found out he was dying, but I would rather have had 31 years being his daughter than 50 being somebody else's. It's a true privilege to have grown up with him and to be able to have called him, you know, my hero, but also my dad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. In the book, you also say in the foreword that the book is purposely concise, but within its pages is a lifetime of work. It's very dense. It's the entrustment of his life's mission. And for you, writing this book elicited a number of emotions. And so it was a combination of finding comfort in his words and in his message, but also pain and agony about the loss and about not being able to ask him what he meant, about something, or throw ideas and exchange ideas together. So tell us about your journey in writing this book, and maybe the efforts you went through in distilling his thinking that was so rich and dense, and but also maybe engaging in these imaginary conversations with him to try to tease out his ideas if you were not sure. Um,
Yeah, the manifesto, we imagine if, but we called it at home the manifesto for ages. It had been a long journey for him. I think he started writing it maybe 2016, 2017. But one of the reasons why he struggled with it so much was this idea of how do you take all of this and put it into something small that people can pick up and read. I always say it's got a nice weight to it for sort of waving in the air. It's a good waving book. So when we found out that that he wouldn't be able to finish it, he asked me to finish it, and we spent a lot of that last 2 weeks working together on it. But I knew, and then I'd sort of have my phone out recording him whilst he was speaking and going through everything. But I knew then that it was a huge gift for him to have asked me to do it, because him living and breathing his work means that by keeping his work going, I'm keeping a part of him alive as well. So it was a huge privilege for him to have asked and trusted me with it. But I also knew, as you say, that it would be, and it was, agony to figure out, what do you leave in, what do you take out, how can I change this without his permission? Would he mind? Would he approve? Would he have an opinion on that? We're lucky to live surrounded by a lot of countryside, and I went for long walks, and I think at times I expected him to kind of come out of the clouds like Mufasa in The Lion King and kind of, bestow on me some, particularly the subtitle. I had such a hard time coming up with that. So there were times when I kind of really did realize that, well, there were times when writing it and getting him in my head, reading everything that he'd written, all of his notes and all of hhis talks and reading all of his books again, was amazing. And then there were times when I go for these walks and I'm like, well, just give me the answer. And that was hard, because then you realize, well, you may feel like he's with me at the moment. And I think, depending on your beliefs, I believe that he is still, just communicating in a way that wasn't quite as succinct as I needed him to be. So processing it, but it actually also, it meant that having him in my head and getting his voice in my head to write the book, kept him with me so much closer. There was almost a sadness in turning the manuscript in, because then I kind of handed it over, and that and then there was sort of a secondary loss of not having it. So it's been an incredible journey, but it's amazing to be at this point where where you have it, where it's coming out.
I can imagine going, like, I love the countryside, going for walks too. When I struggle with something, I just take the street and walk, and then the people that you care for are always there with you, and yes, I can imagine how it could have, those imaginary conversations are not happening when you sit on a desk in front of a computer, but then when you're out in touch with nature, or in touch with the things that somebody loved or that you love to do together. The title of the book is Imagine If, because it really puts at the center imagination. And in the book, you distinguish between imagination and creativity in being applied imagination. And for your father, imagination and creativities were our best resources as human beings, because they are what distinguishes us from every other living being. And it is through imagination that we have created the worlds we live in, and it's through imagination that we can recreate them. We can create a different worlds. So what worlds have we created, and why is it time for a global reimagining?
It's a great question. We make the point in the book that the human world as we know it is created as much out of our minds as it is the physical world. The planet without us on it doesn't have elaborate systems of roads. It doesn't have airports. It doesn't have buildings and cities. These are all things that we've created. And we have a knack as a species that other species don't seem to have to the same level, of being able to reimagine a better reality for ourselves. And so imagination, we define in the book as being the process of being able to bring to mind things that aren't present to our senses. And you're quite right. You can spend all day sitting around being imaginative and not doing anything. you need that next step of a creativity, which Dad said was applied imagination. To if imagination is the ability to conceive of a better reality, creativity is the process of making it happen. And we have done that throughout. We've invented indoor plumbing, and democracy and buildings, and we can fly across the world. So with it, we've got intricate systems of medicine, and we can fight off illness. We've extended our lifespans. We've managed to create relationships with people we never would have ever had the privilege of meeting. The point that we make, though, is that we've also, through all of this, our powers of creativity have brought us to a critical pass, because with that, they've brought war, and inequalities and racism and all of the issues that the plagues on humanity that we've created, that are as much our doing as any, entirely our doing.
Yeah.
We're at a point now where, yes, we're the biggest population ever to be on Earth at any one time. I think the estimate is 100,000 billion people have lived on Earth. 10% of that are on Earth right now. So, from a very basic level, we have to reimagine it, because the planet can't hold this many of us, certainly not consuming at the rate that we all seem to want to consume at.
Yeah.
But despite, being better off health-wise and, our circumstances, for the most part, being materially better off, certainly not for all of us, but for the vast majority of people, we're also seeing huge levels of mental health struggles. There's a massive crisis of mental health, particularly in our young people. We're seeing people disconnected, plagues of loneliness, health crises getting bigger. We're solving them as fast as we can, but there are more of them than there used to be. So we've come far, but the case in the book is that we've not come far enough. And actually, that a lot of the systems that we've created, in particular our education system, have been designed for a bygone era that did an adequate job at the time. I certainly don't think even an exemplary job at the time that they were conceived, but are now outdated. And the time has come to reimagine it, because if you look at what we've achieved as a species now, all of our incredible accolades and things that we've done, just imagine what we could do if we created systems that elevated every person within it rather than systematically keeping them down.
Yeah. And so we really come to the center of the passion of your father and yours, which is education, and really the power of education in fostering a different world, and so fostering a global reimagining to recreate a different world. So in the book, you say that really the purpose of education is to enable students to understand the world around them, the complexity of the world, but also the talents within them. So these two worlds, the inside and the outside, so they can become, first of all, fulfilled individuals. So somebody that is fulfilled, that feels good with himself or with herself, but also active and compassionate citizens. So the idea of really being acting for in terms of creating a better world. So what are the competencies that you think students should acquire in school, so that they can understand this complexity of the world, they can understand the their insights, and they can deal with the challenges, social, political, economic, cultural, of the world that we have created and that we are living in?
It's a really important thing that you said there about living in two worlds. We make the case in the book that we don't just live in one world. We do all live in the physical world, but that we also there's a second world, which is the world within each of us that exists only because you exist. And how there's a huge interplay between the two, because how we experience the world around us is very much influenced by who we are on the inside, and who we are on the inside is very much shaped by our experience of the world around us. So Dad's contention and ours in the book is that the core purpose of education must be to educate young people on both worlds, the world around them, the world within them, and the interplay between the two. So who are they to fit within the world, and what does that look like? And within that, he said, there are four purposes, which are that education must fit purposes which are personal, social, economic, and cultural. And that these four purposes implied 8 core competencies, which all begin with C. So there's creativity, collaboration, compassion, citizenship, criticism, composure, communication, and curiosity. I might have repeated some of them. Did I repeat any
No,
of those?
no,
No?
I think they're
Okay,
probably all of them.
good. Anyway, so these eight core competencies, and he felt it was very important that all of them be interweaved throughout education, that they didn't come online at various ages. You know, you don't trigger compassion at 8 years old and move on to criticism when you're 12.
Yeah,
That they, from day one, they must be incorporated throughout. And the reason that he landed on these 8 C's was that they're no more or less what we expect from any adult that we interact with. You know, they are, when you go to meet somebody, you expect them, you know, to be composed. You expect them to be compassionate. You expect them to be able to take and give criticism, to be active citizens. So those are the eight
yeah,
core competencies that we make the case for in the book.
yeah. They really struck me that they cover three broad dimensions of us as individuals, which is the cognitive. So there are some competencies that are obviously about our cognitive capacities,
Yeah.
but then some competencies that are about our social and emotional, so social and emotional well-being, and then some competencies that are about our behavior and being active citizens. So it's really seeing also us as individual as a whole, that we include the cognitive, the social emotional,
Okay.
and the behavioral. And here in Italy, for example, often the cognitive is given a high priority, and maybe the social emotional and the behavioral less. So it's interesting that your competencies cover these three dimensions. So these are the competencies that you think students should acquire to be fulfilled as individuals, but also to be active and compassionate citizens. So are schools fostering these competencies? In the book, you just juxtapose two visions and structures of education. You already mentioned the fact that education was created for a world that is bygone. So you talk about an industrial model of education versus a vision based on the idea of rewilding education. So can you tell us a bit about these two different types of education?
Yeah, there's a very common analogy that we use when we talk about traditional methods of education. We talk about it being a factory, an industrial factory, and you can see why it's caught on. You know, kids start school at a certain point, and they get in a conveyor belt, they're fed information at certain points, we check them along the way to make sure everyone's sort of of the same standard, and then, you know, they get shipped off into the world. Dad used the analogy, but there's a fundamental flaw to it, which is, you know, things that are created in factories are inanimate. You know, whether it's a car or a wheel or a drill bit, it has no opinion really what happens to it. Whereas people do. You know, children are sentient beings. They aren't different species. You don't come online into life, you know, when you turn 18. They have opinions speaking as a mother with a young child, they have opinions from day one. So Dad felt that the correct metaphor to be using was an industrial farm, the mass production of living things. You know, and in that scenario, what you have is industrial farms. They grow, you know, if you're talking about, say, crops, you know, they separate all the crops out separately. So you've got all the cabbages and all the radishes and everything, you know, in its own little area. Then they make sure they're apart from each other. They don't touch. You know, they spray them with pesticides to keep off the natural insects that would feed upon them, which in turn then kills off the birds that would feed off the insects and the other creatures. What you have at the end, you know, hundreds and thousands of perfect cabbages, but at what cost? You know, you're killing the environment, you're killing the topsoil, you're taking up, you know, more land than you need to. By contrast, and we do the same thing with animals, by the way. You know, we pack them in industrial farms. They get packed into these very small spaces. You know, I think it's something like 80% of the world's use of antibiotics is used on healthy animals, which is leading to all sorts of issues like antibiotic resistance. The far contrast of that, you have regenerative farming, and I will confess, in Dad's earlier iterations of this, he referred to it as organic methods of education, and I felt that was one area where I stepped in. And I thought, actually, you know, at this point, when he first was talking about organic, it was right, but the processes have moved on to the point where I feel like regenerative farming is probably the more appropriate term to be using at the moment. But in those scenarios, what you have are systems where natural ecosystems are not only, you know, created, they're encouraged. So you have crops growing together in close proximities. You have the natural wildlife coming to feed on them. You have the soil is healthy, so the plants are healthy, so the insects are healthy, so the birds are healthy. And at the end, maybe you have some misshapen cabbages. Maybe they don't fit the perfect packaging, but they're more nutritious, and they haven't left this wake of destruction in their path. So Dad felt there was a direct link there with what we do in our systems of education. That the traditional ones as we know them now, you pack children into very small spaces, with not the right air or light qualities, with very little concern often for the physical environment that they're in and the impact that has. You separate them by age, and then within that you separate classes by subject. There's very little cross-pollination between year groups and between subjects. And at the end, yes, you may have, a percentage of the students coming out with these perfect degrees, but there's a wake of destruction. There's, as I said, there's emotional issues caused. There's a lack of self-confidence. There's, a lack of understanding of who they are. And actually, there's a lack of the skills that's needed in the real world. When you come out into the world, what you have at the minute is a deficit of independent thinkers and people who have experienced democracy, who have heard about it maybe, but who have actually experienced it. So you have, in industrial farms, what you have is kind of an imitation of life, and what you have in industrial schools is an imitation of learning, because very often, we know kids, young people, students, they retain information for as long as they have to, and very often it then just goes out. It's being held onto rather than absorbed. So that's the kind of the two sides between it. And the other aspect of that is rewilding, which at the moment, knock on wood, seems to be having a very positive impact in our efforts to help restore the planet, where what you do is you cordon off areas of land, and leave it alone, which seems to be the humankind's hardest skill, is to just leave something. And what you see is nature takes over. The default position of nature is to live its life, and the ecosystems thrive, and things come to be. The same is true then with schools. I'm not suggesting that you cordon off schools and leave them be, but the default nature of children is to learn. They're doing it from the minute they're born. They're picking up on social cues and language and walking, and it's why we have childhood. It's the longer a species childhood, the bigger the brain, the more sophisticated the animal is. We have a very long childhood. It's there to learn. So the analogy there between rewilding in the natural world and rewilding in education is creating conditions for things to happen. Dad talked about how great farmers know that they don't make plants grow. They don't grow them themselves. They don't stick it in the ground and sort of stitch bits on and sprinkle it with pollen. And they create the conditions for plants to grow themselves. They focus on the soil and they create the conditions. And great teachers, great educators, great education systems know that they don't make children learn. They create the conditions for children to learn. And so the analogy there is, how do you create a thriving ecosystem within a school so that learning really happens? Which is what we talk about in the book.
Yeah, so I like, in fact, the fact that you talk about the school as being an ecosystem, because it's a living community, really, of people that are interacting in different ways, through relationship experiences and feelings. And also schools being an ecosystem, but also being part of a broader ecosystem, a context. So they're not just an island in an ocean, but schools are connected with the community, with the context where they are situated. So, and as you say, a healthy school ecosystems then creates the conditions for learning to happen and to flourish, and for children and young people to really discover their talents and pursue their talents, and not being expelled, maybe, like
exactly
situations happen when the child doesn't fit the model and so is expelled. So what does a thriving school system look like? What does it look like according to you and your father?
Well, you're right. A school itself is in and of itself as an ecosystem, but it is part of a much larger ecosystem as well. It's what's called a complex adaptive system. A living complex adaptive system. It's lots of different systems coming together to make the big one work. Within that, there's an Dad had a book that he loved talking about, which was, somebody looked at, and I should know the name of the person, he would know the name of the person, but he did a study into what makes theatre. What do you need for theatre to happen? Do you need a stage? Do you need the lights and the makeup and the costumes? How many people do you need? And what it boils down to is that really, for theatre to happen, you need a performer and an audience, someone doing the theatre and someone absorbing the theatre. You could say the same then for school. What do you need for learning to happen? So if the purpose of school is for learning to take place, what does that look like? And you could take it all away. You could take away the physical building, you could take away the curriculum, you could take it all away. What you need is somebody learning and somebody teaching. And those roles can flip back and forth and very often do, but that's at its core. Education is about the relationship between teachers and students. So the goal then has to be for any school ecosystem to make sure that that relationship is healthy and thriving. A big part of that is trusting teachers to do their job. There's very few careers where the level of micromanagement that teachers are put under would stand. Because you have to trust that teaching isn't, it's not just a career. It's not even just a vocation. It's an art form. A great teacher knows a myriad of different techniques and when to use them and when to back off and how to scaffold. So you have to have a system that has, first of all, continues to develop their teachers, but develop them to a certain point and then continues to develop them and support them, but also that trusts them, that isn't constantly saying, if your kids don't pass the grade, then, you won't get you won't either. So that's the first. It values its teachers. The second is that it's interdisciplinary. We talk a lot about, I said about, the system having subjects, art at this time, and then that's totally different from science, which is totally different from maths. And in reality, we know that there's a huge amount of maths in the arts, and there's a huge amount of arts in the sciences, and the science and maths are linked. And so the benefit of approaching disciplines is that you take the core aspects that you need to learn, and cross-pollinate them between disciplines. You become interdisciplinary. So that's a big one of a healthy ecosystem, is you stop separating so much. And on that, you then stop separating children by age group, because it makes sense from an admin point of view, all the 6-year-olds together and the 7-year-olds together. But it makes very little sense in terms of how children grow and develop. Children learn different things at different paces. If you're a parent, you know that. You have a baby and you're like, well, who's going to talk first? Who's going to walk first? But they do it in their own time. And, for all being well, it's will do all of it at some point. So that's a big one when it comes to a healthy school ecosystem. You also recognize that children have a lot to learn from each other, that very often young children learn better when being taught by somebody who's a bit older than them, and the older children retain their information better for having an opportunity to teach and mentor a younger child. That, a teacher being brought into that can learn from the students and vice versa. So mixing age groups based on the stage that they're at, as opposed to their birthday, it just makes a lot more sense not from an admin sense, but from a learning sense, which ultimately is what we're here. It personalizes learning. There's that's the hot topic. That's the contentious one, where people say, but it's not feasible. There are too many kids. You can't make it personal. The point we make in the book is that's just a moot point. Learning is personal. For learning to happen, the learner has to be engaged in the process. It has to be, it is personal to them. And the other point to say is that it is totally possible. There are examples of schools all around the world who are doing it. The technologies that we have now make it much more easier than it was previously. And also that a lot of the systems that we have in place, you mentioned children being expelled or excluded for not fitting with the system. Very often they go into alternative provided resources which implement personalized learning, and everything else, and across age and all sorts, to feed them back in. If the systems of education were personalized to begin with, we wouldn't need, there'd be much less people going off on different tracks. The schedule's flexible. We talked about that as well, rather than, we make the point in the book that if in an office setting, every 45 minutes you rang a bell and asked everybody to stand up and move to a different room and think about something completely different, you'd go mad. Different thing. Again, it makes sense from an admin point of view, but different activities take different amounts of time. Sometimes, for me, it takes 45 minutes to get my head into anything, so the thought that then I just get stopped and moved. Some things take much less time. You can do it in 10 minutes. So keeping the schedule flexible is really important. Keeping assessment in perspective is really important, which isn't to say that assessment in and of itself isn't vital. It's hugely important to learning. You have to make sure that there are various checks along the way.
Mm-mm.
But do we need assessment that's high stakes, that's standardized, that compares countries against each other, let alone cities or classes? No, not to the level that becomes the be all and end all. You need to have checks along the way,
Yeah,
to make sure that people are coming along the way that you would expect them to. So keeping assessment intrinsic and integrated and in perspective.
yeah,
Um, Understanding the importance of play. Yeah, I
yeah,
mentioned that, depending on the species, the length of childhood depends on the brain development. In mammals, infant mammals play based on the skills that they'll most need to learn. So tigers pounce, on each other, and rough and tumble monkeys swing through trees.
mm,
Um, we have imaginative play, and we do that because actually the skills that we need will be about using our imaginations. It's how children make sense of the world. They put themselves in situations, they give themselves power when they wouldn't ordinarily have them. So seeing play not as a luxury or a break time,
yeah,
but actually as a really important phase of learning, um, is massive. And I have two more. Considering the physical environment, I said you could strip it all
yeah,
away, but it really helps if there's one that's fit for purpose, and
yeah,
we know now there's a lot of work gone into light levels affect learning, oxygen quality affects learning, seats, tables.
yeah,
You don't always need to be in a hard chair and then getting told off for being uncomfortable, essentially. So
yeah,
really taking the physical environment into perspective, and then finally valuing the voice of the participants. So giving a voice, remembering why we're doing it. At the
yeah,
heart of education are children, young people, and students. And
yeah,
so it baffles me that the one voice that we systematically suppress are the voice of the people who don't have a choice in whether or not they're involved in it.
yeah,
You know, and we want people to come out of school to be passionate and engaged citizens. We do that by giving them opportunities and examples of that from a very early age.
yeah.
Very long answer, but there you go.
No, but that
Well,
covers all the aspects, and I think it's interesting that yeah, you talked about all the different aspects, from the interdisciplinary way of teaching
mhm,
to the mixed age group, to
yeah,
having a schedule more flexible, to the physical environment, games, putting students at the center. But what struck me was that the first was valuing teachers, and uh, probably this interview will be heard by many teachers. So I think really valuing teachers and trusting teachers, as you say, is important. They know their job, they have the competencies, they have to be given the freedom to experiment,
really,
to try out different things, and then put in, again, the relationship, the teachers and the voice of students on the other side. And
exactly.
um, and this brings me to the last question. And I really like the way you end the book with a reference to rock and roll music, my favorite music. And
Yeah,
and you say, rock and roll was not a government-led initiative, was not something uh, that came down from the top down, because
yeah,
revolutions and change happens from the bottom up, happens from the people on the ground that have an idea, use their imagination, use their creativity, and do something different. So to bring about these healthy ecosystems that you
mhm,
talked about, that values teachers, that is interdisciplinary, that breaks down barriers of age and time, and um, what can schools do, and in particular, what can teachers do
mhm.
to bring about this new vision, this reimagining of education?
Dad always said that if you're a teacher to the children in your class, you are the education system. They don't care what's happening, at the school down the street, what's happening in the next classroom necessarily. They certainly don't care what's happening in schools on the other side of the world. For them, their daily experience is you in your classroom. You are their experience of education. So Dad always said, if you change your practice, within the realms of what you're capable of doing, but if you change what you're doing for the children in your class, you have changed the education system. No one can boil the ocean. You can't solve every problem. A teacher's responsibility is not to educate every single child in the world. You have a responsibility to the children in your class under your care. And if you implement what we've talked about, if you see them as people rather than test scores, if you get to know the kids in your class, which every great teacher does, then for the children in your class, you that's it. You've created an education system that has worked for them, and then if every teacher does that, then you have a seamless transition through. And Dad's point was that if enough educators change the way they educate, the system begins to bend and it begins to break. And he's right, education doesn't happen behind closed doors. It doesn't happen in policy rooms. It doesn't happen when people pass laws. It happens on the day-to-day basis of children walking into a classroom and teachers being there to teach them. So again, the fact that there's so much in play, and I understand it, the lives of children is a big responsibility, and no one's campaigning for there not to be accountability within the system. But the way I see it, if you hire a teacher to do a job, let them do it. And if you make it mandatory for children to go into school, then let them have a say in their experience of it. And there's a partnership there, because when you take everything away, you have a teacher and a student. So it is. Dad said that. I said about farmers knowing that they create the conditions for soil, for plants to grow, and great teachers know they can create the conditions for learning to happen. Dad said that miracles happen every single day. In nature, life is miraculous. To be born at all is miraculous. When you look at the odds of it, and we make a point in the book that the actual chance of you being born at all is sky high, and the various lives that have interwoven to bring you to the point that your life exists. It's a miracle that you're there. But when you say it's a miracle, it sounds like it's a rare thing. Miracles happen once in a while. They happen every single day. And in education, they happen every single day. So Dad's belief was that if you're an educator, you're in the miracle business. And he said it was the best business to be in. It's the only business really to be in. So it's very important to value teachers and to let them and students know that the power, the system falls apart if they're not a part of it.
Yeah, it just gives back power to teachers and to students, and so they have the power to change, even if it is in their little classroom or in their school. But you can change if you want, and so that's
exactly.
a very positive and empowering message, certainly.
I think so.
Kate, I have no more question, but if you would like to add anything to just a final reflection, a final comment, a final message for Italian teachers that will be reading the book and listening to this interview.
I do. I suppose, the big one is that it can feel like, you say, when you're in a classroom that you're burdened by so much. In particular, you've got your own. So, we certainly over here, teachers are paid to do the time that they spend with children, but then there's all the time that they spend actually making that possible. It can be easy to feel alone or isolated, or like you're the only person experiencing those things. And, there is a grassroots revolution happening. There is a movement of people who can envision a better future for us all, who are creating a future for us all. And I guess the thing that I would like to say is to become involved, to reach out, to find other like-minded people, and to join the revolution, because it needs to happen, and it is happening.
Yeah, and certainly you are part of this revolution, because I see you are very active in bringing forward the ideas and the message and the legacy of your father. So certainly you are continuing his work with your own work, with your own life, and I'm sure your professional life, probably your life as a mother. So these ideas are living on with you and the other people that he has inspired. And
I believe there's never been a more important time for it. We're facing such complex challenges in the world at the moment, and he felt that the more complex the challenges become, the more creative we have to be to meet them. We have to be adaptable and creative, and I wish he was here to do it with me, but it's a privilege to be doing it, to be continuing his work.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. It's lovely to speak to you.